offices, I'd like to acknowledge the unceded lands of the Goshoot and Shoshone peoples and the continued existence and contributions of Indigenous people who have lived on and cared for this land for thousands of years. I'm really excited today to welcome you all and Representative Winder to this listening session that we have set up. I am Kate Rubicava, the Chief Executive Officer for the Utah Nonprofits Association. And Representative Winder serves he serves District 30 in the House here in Utah. He has received lots of recognitions and honors. He's been the best of state mayor, City Weekly's Best Reason Not to Underestimate West Valley City, Utah Business Magazine's 40 Rising Stars Under 40, and also an Eagle Scout. In the State House, he serves on a variety of committees: the Business, Economic Development and Labor Committee, Labor Appropriations Committee, the House Business and Labor Committee, House Economic Development and Workforce Services Committee, the Business and Labor Interim Committee, the Economic Development and Workforce Services Interim Committee, and the Legislative Policy Summit. And we're just really excited that Representative Winder, that you have decided to spend some time with us today and answering some of our membership questions about getting engaged and some of the other general questions that our members might have. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the time over to you for your opening remarks.
Great, thanks Kate, and so good to be with all of you today. I hope you're okay that I'm not in a suit and tie and legislative mode. It seems we all get a little casual during pandemics, especially when it's summertime, but you guys get that, and great to be with you. I love the Utah Nonprofits Association. UNA has a wonderful presence on the Hill, and you should know as your members that they're building great relationships with legislators. They are advocating well for the nonprofit community. And one of the best things they're doing, I think, is educating us lawmakers on the important role that nonprofits play in Utah's economy. I think it's easy sometimes for a legislator to dismiss a nonprofit saying, well, they're not paying taxes, so what are they contributing to our economy? And they underestimate the payroll taxes of employees, but also that more importantly, the cultural and societal effects that nonprofits have in Utah. One of the reasons Utah to me is the brightest star on the flag, to use a Gary Herbertism, is because of the great nonprofits we have. And sometimes we take the nonprofits we have in the state for granted, but during pandemics, we have this weird dynamic where we're not able to help support them and fund them as much as we'd like, and yet we need them more than ever. And so as Utah's looking to climb out of this pandemic, the nonprofit sector is going to be a huge asset and huge help to us to do this. It's interesting when you look at, we just had our 5th special session, our 3rd one this year, and it's interesting because you look at it and you look at some of the things that we're able to accomplish there. It's actually a really good special session. We've never in the history of Utah had 27 items on the special session call, and yet we chunked through it in one day. We had asked all of our state agencies to prepare what would a 2% budget cut look like, 5% and 10%, and we ended up only having to cut 1.7% of the state budget. Just put that in perspective, of the 32,000 state employees, there were 700 FTE loss, and I think virtually all of them were just funds that were not going to be hired for. They weren't necessarily layoffs per se. So Utah is kind of the envy of the nation on that. We used about 27% of our rainy day fund. We have several rainy day funds, but we dipped in $680 million so that some of our social services and education funding would be held harmless and actually grow a little bit. Utah has a better rainy day fund than most states, so we're lucky to have that. Although there's a strategy there, you don't want to spend all of it because we don't know how long this pandemic will go. And we saw with the Great Recession last time that, yeah, the rainy day fund was helpful in that first year. For the next year 2 and 3, it really helped kind of even things out as we grew back into normalcy, whatever that may look like this time. Just another interesting note, maybe in some opening comments, is you see there's 26 states that'll have revenue shortfalls, and some of those are cutting, 4 of those states are cutting 20% or more of their budget. And so the fact that we could just do a 1.7% cut is actually pretty remarkable. So I'm excited about where Utah is for all the craziness going on, and it could be a lot worse. But I think we're also positioned to climb out of this as well as possible, and I think that bodes well for our nonprofit community as well. But I want to spend the bulk of today just answering Q&A and hearing what's on your mind. There's a lot of things. Just by way of background, my day job is I work for the city of Mill Creek. I'm their economic development director, and so I've worked at Winder Dairy, Winder Farms before, Zions Bank, Summit Group Communications, as well as West Valley City, where I was on their economic development staff for 4 years, and then city council for 4 years, and then mayor for 4 years. So I bring kind of a mix of background of private sector and public sector that's been helpful as a legislator too. So yeah, I want to just open it up to questions and hear what's on your mind, whether it's public health issues, whether it's state budget issues, or other things, and see how we can be helpful to you.
Thank you so much. We actually have a few pre-submitted questions, and I know that Dell is on the line. And Dell, would you like to ask the questions that you sent in, or would you like me to ask them?
Is that Dell Brady?
Yes, sir.
It is. Good morning, Representative Winder. Good to see you again. Thanks for speaking to us today.
Good morning. Good to have you, Dell.
Thank you.
And you're at the Red Cross, if I remember right.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. I'm Executive Director over the Greater Salt Lake Area chapter of the Red Cross, and just thrilled to join with the other nonprofit colleagues in our state. One of the questions I had for you, Representative, was how is, and I realize it's still relatively early in the game, but from your perspective, how's this pandemic impacting the economic development of Utah's cities and towns? You shared a bit at the state level, but wondering if you can share some insight about the local government impact.
It's interesting. We're finding on the 20th of each month, we get the sales tax reports from 2 months ago. So we just got this morning, actually, they were a few days late. We got this morning the sales tax reports for April. But just backing up to March, as we started going into this, what we found in March is it was really a tale of two cities, no pun intended. But you had cities like Moab that was down 34%, Park City was down 28%, some really serious sales tax drops for those tourist towns. But then you saw other cities. Riverton had a record year. I know Mill Creek, where we were at, we were up 17% because we have grocery stores and Home Depot and other businesses doing really well. And we're seeing with the reports that just came out this morning, kind of a similar thing where some of the cities actually were not hit as bad as they feared. Let me just pull this up here. We're seeing that overall there's a little bit of a decline, but a number of cities are actually up quite a bit. And so it really is hitting different parts of the state differently. We're seeing that with industries too. The restaurant industry took a huge hit and it is starting to come back. Whereas grocery stores are having a record year. We're seeing the tourism sector taking a huge hit. Obviously, if you're in hospitality at all, it's brutal right there. But we're starting to see even that climbing back a little bit, especially as instead of taking that trip to Europe, maybe someone's going up to Zermatt or taking their family down to Moab. And so Bear Lake, the lodging at Bear Lake Memorial Day weekend was actually just packed with locals. And so it's kind of an interesting dynamic even as that recovers. But cities have been bracing for the worst, and the CARES Act funds have been helpful to them. But also the sales tax numbers are climbing back quicker than we had feared. And we're in some cases even better than we were a year ago, which is a bizarre state of affairs. You're also seeing Utah with the second lowest unemployment rate in the nation right now, which helps. And of course, the downside with us getting back to normal so quickly is we are seeing the spike in outbreaks. and maybe there'll be another question about the public health stuff later. But to answer your question, Dale, cities are actually, most cities, I should say, are actually hanging in there fairly well from where they were a year ago. And part of that was because of the healthy economy going into it. It's kind of like an example to think of it as this. Ben McAdams was on a plane from Washington, D.C. in March. He'd been on 5 hours of sleep. He'd been running meeting to meeting. COVID hit him, and it hit him hard. He was hospitalized. Whereas if he would even admit if he was caught up better on his health and his sleep, maybe it wouldn't have hit him quite as bad. And that's how the economy is too. Utah was relatively healthy. So when this pandemic hit Utah, we're going to be able to weather it better than most places, fortunately. And I hope that success trickles down to the nonprofits too.
Super. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that we actually do have a public health question for you. Kate?
Okay.
Yes, you teed us up quite nicely, Representative Winder. So how do you balance the public health crisis with the economic need to reopen, especially now as we have seen record high number of cases of COVID-19?
That is a great question. First of all, there's a few different things to think about. Tony Samarand is a sports writer for the Salt Lake Tribune. And when the pandemic hit, they said to Tony, all right, you're not gonna have a lot of sports to report on, but being a sports guy, you're actually really good with stats. So can you dig into some of the stats of what's going on nationally and internationally and locally regarding coronavirus and how it affects us? And so I've become a big fan of Tony at the Salt Lake Tribune because every week he's coming out with just some amazing data crunching to help explain this. And one of the things he pointed out in his report this week is you're way better off to get coronavirus today in Utah, or in America for that matter, than you were in March. There's a few reasons because of that. One is you're seeing that we just understand this disease better than we did in March. We're still learning a lot. It is a novel or new coronavirus, but we're learning a lot. But when it hits in March, we weren't sure how to treat it. We're able to do some things to help treat it better so that it's not as bad. And we're actually seeing some interesting numbers with, although the number of cases are rising in Utah, and yes, that is alarming, the percentage of hospitalized per case is actually flat or dropping. June 15th is 7.13%. June 17th it was 7.2%. Yesterday it was down to 6.8%. So we're seeing that the percentage of those getting it that are hospitalized are actually dropping a little bit. And the ICU number has been relatively flat. The ICU rate per active case was 1.24% a week ago and is now 0.96%. And so we're seeing, as you look at the daily numbers, we're seeing that the raw number of cases is going up, but we're also seeing that ICU is going up a little bit in some cases, but it's relatively flat, and the deaths are relatively flat. Yesterday, for example, you had 0 deaths in Utah, which was phenomenal, even though you had over 300 new cases. Dr. Angela Dunn has said, and it's all over the news today, of course, hey, if we do not get those case counts down by July 1, we may have to go back to orange. But you're going to see from the Herbert Cox administration that no way are we going to go backwards. We just need to figure out how to cope as we go forward. And a big part of that, frankly, is mask wearing. I'm back in the office at Mill Creek, and pretty much most of our office is back. But when we ever leave our office or cubicles to go talk to somebody, you put your mask on, and you wash your hands a lot, and you use your hand sanitizer, and you social distance where possible. I know not all organizations have this ability, but let me show you what our conference room looks like right now in Mill Creek. It looks like this, where everyone sits 6 feet apart. Now we're lucky to have a big room that we can do that. And our council chamber is similarly spaced out. But we've concluded that we need to serve the public here, and we have to be here for them because we do have people coming in. And so how do we do that? What does the new normal look like? You're also seeing a situation where the viruses tend to mutate, and the coronavirus has already mutated over 500 times. One of the things that we forget about is with the Spanish flu, as awful as that was 100 years ago, how we solved it was as the virus mutated, and this is a really weird thing, viruses are living things and their goal is to spread. And so if a virus gets you and kills you immediately, that doesn't help it spread. The virus, from its natural selection, is better to get you and live with you for as long as possible so it can spread. So what we saw with the Spanish flu is over time, after about a year or so, it became less fatal, but therefore it was easier to spread. And so now it's just part of our normal flu strain. We're seeing that with coronavirus, where because it's mutating, it is less deadly today than it was in March. All the stats are bearing that out. And so you're seeing a situation where, I'll pick on Ben McAdams again because he's a friend. When you get coronavirus in March, you're more likely to be a Ben McAdams where you may spend a few days in the hospital. Whereas you get coronavirus here in June in Utah and you're more like John Huntsman, where it's horrible and it lays you flat, but you're not in the hospital and you can even muscle through a debate if you had to. And so we're seeing it not affect people as bad, which is, the bad news is it's spreading more. The good news is it's not as bad. The other thing to think about is a lot of people say, well, we should all just get it and have herd immunity. But realize, here's a stat that our Speaker of the House presented in our caucus the other day that he had from the epidemiologist. Even if Utah were averaging 500 cases a day, which is way higher than we want to be, it would take 15.2 years for Utah to hit herd immunity. 15.2 years. The other thing to think about is when they say, hey, we're going to hustle and rush a vaccine out, the polls are showing that over half the population in Utah would not take that vaccine initially. And yes, you have a certain percentage of Utahns that are anti-vaxxers that wouldn't take it, but you also have a lot that I'll call cautious vaxxers. They would say, you know what, I get my polio shot and I'm glad I do, because that's been tried and true for decades. But when this coronavirus vaccine comes out, I'm not sure I want to be the guinea pig. Let's let a few other people do it for a few months or years first. And so you think about that, you think, okay, we're more than a decade away from herd immunity. The vaccine, yeah, a lot of the population will take it, but not all. So how do we cope in the meantime? Because we can't just stay closed up in our caves forever. That would crater the economy. Hawaii has a 35% unemployment rate right now, worse than the Great Depression. Because why? If you fly into Hawaii right now, they require you to quarantine for 14 days before you can leave your hotel room. And different states are grappling with this in different ways. And so it's tough. One of the things we're seeing is Ohio opened up about the same time Utah did, but they're seeing cases going down, not up. So what's Ohio doing differently than Utah? Well, I can tell you, it's the simple things. It's the mask wearing. It's the washing your hands. It's socially distancing where possible. I think it's absolutely ridiculous that UTA is not requiring masks on all buses and trains. They require shirts, they require shoes. Why wouldn't you require a mask? As we look at schools, going back to school in the fall, personally, I think that kids should be required to wear a mask too. And I know that says, well, the kids will just play with them, they'll take them off, whatever. But guess what? It's working in Asia. And you're seeing cases, you're seeing great examples in Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea where the cases are dropping. In schools today, we have a dress code where you can't wear hats and you can't wear gang colors and you can't wear spaghetti straps. We can require a mask too. I know we all hate wearing a mask, but that's proving to be simple. I was talking to a friend on Sunday. I said, it's kind of like the story of Moses and the Israelites, where they were bit by the fiery serpents, and to be healed, all they had to do was look at Moses' staff. And a lot of them died because that was too simple. Well, it's the simple things of wearing a mask, washing your hands, social distancing that are going to be what helps get us through this. And so I would say we need to keep opening up the economy, but boy, let's still keep to those simple things, because we are not out of the woods by a long shot with this. So I know that was a long, rambly answer, but hopefully there's some nuggets in there that may be helpful or interesting to you.
Yeah, and I actually have a follow-up to that, because you really honed in quite a lot about mask wearing and the importance of doing that. what can we expect to see from our elected officials in terms of mandating the wearing of masks while in public, as some other states in the region have also done, so that we can, as you mentioned, see a decline in the transmission of COVID-19?
That's a great question. I think you see the Herbert and Cox administration is quite proud that Utah was one of the few states that never mandated a stay-at-home order. Like, I think there's all but 7 states that didn't mandate it. They suggested it, and they were pleased that we were able to keep our case counts and death counts so low just on suggesting. They're banking on that same strategy for mask wearing, and I think time will tell if that's successful or not. Part of the problem is you're in the middle of a political election year, and that's a big complicating factor because you have the lieutenant governor running for governor, you have all the House of Representatives up for re-election, and half the Senate. And so in Utah, we're fiercely proud of being independent, and we don't want to have the government force us to do anything, let alone muzzle our faces with a mask, right? And so the hard thing is, there's a lot of Utahns that will not wear a mask if they're ordered to, but they might if it's suggested, and they can come up with their own reason on why they should. And so we have some interesting political dynamics and fierce independent streaks in Utah that I do not think that you will see mandatory mask wearing in public by the governor, for good or for bad. I don't think you'll see us going back to orange, even though Dr. Dunn said that we might have, or that we maybe should, if cases keep going up, because those political realities. But I think that puts a bigger burden on nonprofits, businesses, local governments to try to get the word out about wearing your mask. And part of the problem was, in this country, we had the CDC back in March said, don't wear masks. You're going to touch your face more and maybe even increase spread unless you're sick. And if you look back in the news feeds back in March, there's all sorts of, Business Insider, CDC reports were saying, don't wear a mask. And then now we're saying, wear a mask, wear a mask. And I think nationally, problematic. Some say CDC stands for change direction constantly, because we've been flip side of it. But in Utah, we need to have people wear masks. In Lagoon, you had to wear masks going in. Now they're saying, okay, wear masks when you're in line for rides too. So I think people are realizing, hey, you got to wear your mask. But you're not going to see a governor mandate that in this political environment this year, for good or for bad. So good follow-up question.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from one of our members, and I'm going to be reading it from what was submitted.
Okay.
So what do you feel is the state leaders' responsibility to move forward to have housing that our communities can afford? Our essential workers who have been providing services throughout the pandemic can afford housing. And what they've seen since the pandemic started is that the number of evictions was reduced, but we've seen a large increase in lease terminations. They also witnessed how state and legislative leaders failed the communities of color on the west side of Salt Lake County. And we would like to hear your opinion on that.
That's a great question. And I suspect that came from the Utah Housing Coalition, who's one of your awesome members. And I love what they do. And there's a lot of people that are part of the Housing Coalition that are doing good things. It's interesting because I work for a city that's east of the Jordan River, but I represent a district that's west of the Jordan River, West Valley City. And so it's kind of interesting to see the different dynamics. We're seeing some interesting things in Utah. Nationally, home sales dropped 9.5% during this pandemic, but in Utah, that's not been the case. Utah's real estate market has stayed strong, but that it also is showing that the Utah housing crisis did not go away. Just because there's a pandemic, the housing crisis has not gone away. In fact, in some ways—
I'm sorry, Representative Winter, you're covering up your microphone. It's hard to hear.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's much better. Thank you.
Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
But the Utah housing crisis has not gone away because of the pandemic. It's a situation where what was existing in January as far as a need for housing is probably exacerbated for our affordable housing community. I think local governments have a big opportunity to play in our affordable housing crisis. When I've been involved with setting up redevelopment areas or community reinvestment areas here in Mill Creek, for example, in all cases, we've had the affordable housing share of that increment be higher than what's required by state law, and we're utilizing that in the city of Mill Creek. I know West Valley City is taking great strides towards affordable housing as well. So I think the city level is an important place where we need to address that, because we can't just say not in our backyard. Housing affordability is addressed in a couple ways. Fundamentally, there is a supply and demand problem. Anytime we have housing built in Utah, that's going to help alleviate some of that pressure. Because even a house in Olympus Cove, in a weird way, helps with the housing situation, because now you have the family in the valley that is looking to move to that bigger, fancier home. They move, and now there's someone that can move out of their townhome into their home, and there's someone that can move out of their condo into their townhome, and there's someone that can move out of their apartment into that condo and have home ownership for the first time. So there is kind of a trickle down effect with housing. But we're seeing, especially with the low AMI, some acute housing where that alone does not do it. And we do have to provide some additional housing assistance. I think it's important for state leaders to realize that even though we're dealing with the pandemic and acute racial issues right now and economic issues, the housing crisis has not gone away. And that, to me, is one of the most serious things facing Utah. We need to keep not only talking about it and putting it at the forefront of mind of state leaders, remind your legislators that there is still a housing crisis, but also look for solutions. We put a lot of money in the last session into helping with affordable housing. We need to keep putting more in, frankly, as our economy recovers. So there may be some follow-up with that. I know I was a little rambly there, Housing Coalition friends, but hopefully I touched on a few of the things you're looking for.
And I was going to say, yes, there is a follow-up, and I would like to turn the time over now to the Utah Housing.
Thank you so much, Representative Winder. My name is Francisca Blanc. Even it shows Utah Housing Coalition, that is our professional account. I'm also a new resident in Mill Creek, and I live very closely to the new development that we're going to take place. I'm excited to see how we're going to look. I just want to do a follow-up kind of to give you a big picture view of what we've been seeing since the end of March. Was literally a few days after the session ended and we were shut down. So initially, all of our efforts went into providing resources online to residents to connect them to the DWS and community health clinics and so forth. You know, the eviction moratorium definitely helps. It ended on May 15, and what was happening in the ground, although we have received a lot of money from the federal government, the money did not hit the community agencies prior to May 15. And we have not seen a lot of eviction notices going to people, but what we have seen a lot of lease terminations, and which resulted also in higher rents. So that was kind of another way to go around the legal process. And, you know, community agencies, especially Utah Community Action, which is serving Sully County and Tooele County, receives, you know, hundreds of calls, you know, a week from people requiring assistance. We also, due to Housing Coalition, we're looking at housing from the social determinants of health perspective, where, you know, it was so evident that, you know, housing is healthcare, housing is education, housing is justice. And I mentioned the communities of color on the west side of Sully County who have been hit pretty hard. And when you look at these residents, most of them are essential workers. You know, they're cashiers, they're working in restaurants, they might be providing daycare, and they lost their jobs or their income was heavily reduced. And some of those folks who are immigrants work 2 jobs or 3 jobs even, and they just cannot make it. This past Sunday, the Deseret News had an excellent article showing how the community is coming together to help themselves, but it really put a very clear picture of what's happening on the west side of Salt Lake City, which people are truly suffering, and they're worried about their health, about their nutrition, about making their house payments. So those are things that we have seen coming from the ground, and we are, we're happy to meet with you and, provide you some policy solutions that can be happening at the state level. But I'm wondering how do you look at those issues, especially what's been happening on the west side? How do you think you can propose some solutions?
Yeah, no, great question, Francisca, and great issues. I appreciate all you do, and good to hear from you in Mill Creek. As she mentioned, we have a big city center development going on around Highland Drive and 13th East and 33rd South, where we'll see hundreds of new units in there. We'll have $5 million that have to be spent for affordable housing in that area based on our CRA agreements. So, and Mayor Silvestrini wants to keep that in Mill Creek and have a good mix of affordable housing sprinkled out with the market rate housing. So I feel like Mill Creek's a city that's doing it right and has some good plans. Francisca mentioned some of the more immediate needs on the west side of the valley, and we see those are very real, and those are happening. It's tricky because when you have an emergency declaration, it puts it's designed for more how to recover from an earthquake, for example. It's not really designed, the emergency declarations aren't really designed for a year-long pandemic like we're seeing. And so the eviction moratorium, for example, that expired May 15th, that because of how our emergency declaration is set up, that power rests solely with the governor. And so there's been some talks in legislative circles as do we need to look at how we do our emergency declarations to better accommodate a longer emergency like a pandemic. And to me, the housing piece and how to deal with that would be one aspect of that we'd want to look at. The cases that we're seeing where people are losing their apartment and like you say, it's not so much an eviction, Francisca, as a lot of those, their leases are up and they're not renewing. And so those are people who are on the street and having to find new places. I don't have a good, easy answer for that. I know it's a real problem. I know it's that Francisca is absolutely correct, where we have families that are hurting and suffering, and we're kind of shuttling them from one need to another. And thank heavens for the good nonprofits who are helping with some of these situations. But that's a case where we don't have a good long-term answer for today. And we need to look at what are some resources we can have in place for that safety net so that, nobody should require a landlord to have somebody rent from them longer than they need to. Sometimes they're doing different things with their building, or we've even heard of some cases where they've moved in themselves into property they formerly rented. That's a case too, because as the economic effect has a cascading effect, and so you'll see middle-class people moving into rental properties that previously were home ownership. So I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for you, Francesca, but I do have some empathy because I know it's real and I know it's something we're dealing with in West Valley City and elsewhere in the valley.
Thank you so much. We'll reach out to you.
Yes, please. Always welcome.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, I have a feeling you're going to hear from her.
Good. I hope so.
Me too. Which, when you were talking about this and moving through the state of emergency, it did bring up a question that we have. Why was the decision made to extend the state of emergency to August 20th instead of letting it expire at the end of the month? And did you personally support this extension? If so, why or why not?
I did support the extension. It's a delicate thing. We have federal funds, for example, and some flexibility on how to spend those funds that can only happen if we're in a state of emergency still. And so we would be, this gave us a lot of heartburn as legislators, because the state of emergency shifts a lot of power to the governor's branch, or to the executive branch, the governor's office. And so what we did is we said, okay, we're going to extend the state of emergency till August 20th, because we'll have our next special session then, and we can reassess where we are. But we also were putting some additional guidelines in on how much the executive branch could spend on no bid contracts, for example. You saw some of the cases in the news where there's a lot of state money going out to no bid contracts for apps that were maybe more expensive than they should have spent money on, for instance. So we're trying to put some controls there as well. Realize too, just because a state of emergency is extended, that doesn't mean, people sometimes confuse that with a stay-at-home order. And that doesn't mean that just because we're in a state of emergency doesn't mean that we're going back to orange or red. Those are actually kind of different things. But the state of emergency I did support, because it would be penny wise and pound foolish to walk away from federal dollars and flexibility on spending those federal CARES Act funds by coming out of the state of emergency already. I don't know a state in the union that's out of their state of emergency already. And I think to be the first out may be nice bragging rights, but it costs us a lot of money, and that money ends up going to some people who need it most in the end, doesn't it?
Thank you for that information and for your perspective. Sorry, I'm trying to find the right question. So Senate Bill 5005 provides organizations, commercial businesses, and families with rental and mortgage assistance if they were impacted by COVID-19. When can nonprofits begin applying for this aid, and how much money was appropriated by the state? Do you think it will dry up soon? We'd love to hear more about that.
Okay, there was let me look at some of my notes here. I'll try to look for these without covering my microphone.
I know I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. So the funds for that is basically we widened access to the $122 million in federal COVID funds. This is on the rental assistance. We eased rules for spending up to 20 million of the housing aid and 40 million in grants for rental assistance for commercial tenants. And so for the commercial tenants, nonprofits can, my understanding is they can apply for that right away for rental assistance. But I also think they have to do some rule writing to create how they can do that. But nonprofits, if they need help on their rent, because I suspect most of you are tenants in your buildings and don't necessarily own them, that will be a pot you can apply for. I'm not sure if they've opened that up quite yet or not. I don't have that at my fingertips. Maybe that's something we can email to the group after the call. But there's also an interesting thing where Representative Spenlove sponsored a bill that we approved that this is HB 5010 that does $62 million in cultural assistance and economic recovery grants. And that's going to be one that frankly helps a lot of the nonprofits as well, especially our cultural organizations. And to access those funds, what it'll do is it'll say, okay, if you offer a discount for your museum, for example, there'll be some funds from that to fill in that gap and to help get people to come out and to enjoy that that tourist experience. I see Tara Rollins is on the call. She may know even some additional details beyond a lowly legislator.
Well, actually, I was just pulling up an Excel spreadsheet, and I was going to offer some help here. So there is a lot of funding that came into the state in terms of helping with rental assistance. And so the first funding that came out was ESG funding from the state, as well as they Only Walker Housing Loan Fund also allocated $1 million of their home funds. And so those have been contracted out. And so the total of that amount was $5.2 million. And so anybody who is needing help in the state, what they need to do is they need to dial 211 and tell them where they live, and then they can access the funding accordingly. So if everybody on the line is familiar with community action programs, those are the agencies that were allocated the funding. And so, for example, 6-county AOG, they received, $425,000 to help with rental assistance. And so the second round of funding that will be coming out is there's also CSBG funding and then CDBG funding that entitlement cities got, as well as there's a second round of CDBG that went directly to the state. And so we'll be looking to see how that goes out. And then also Salt Lake City has put almost, I think it's about $10.5 million into rental assistance as well as mortgage assistance. So the $20 million that was initially allocated through the COVID-19 funding from the state was initially to start August 1st. And the thinking behind that was that end of July, people were going to start losing the $600 extra in unemployment, as well as most people would have probably received their stimulus funding. So during the special session, they did change that, and so that money is available now. And so the state, put out to a lot of partners in terms of how do we think that should be distributed through the state. And so my understanding is that they're going to distribute $10 million. And I think it's based on renters in each county, but it will also be available to use for mortgages. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Tara.
Thanks, Tara. This is a good reminder of why we need good nonprofit executive directors and others, because they're full-time on this, and us legislators are trying to juggle multiple jobs. So, thanks,
well,
Tara.
I think the only thing that we're missing right now in terms of help, we have the funding, but we don't have funding to really, beef up our mediation program statewide. Right now, we're extremely lucky. Salt Lake County has Utah Community Action and the mediation program there. It's amazing the work that she's doing with landlords and helping tenants come together and figure out how to keep them housed, what the payment plans can look like, a few months out. And so, from the very beginning, I've been trying to get the governor's economic task force, the spinoff housing group, to be pushing that. And so I think that's where we need to be putting some money, is to help landlords and tenants come together, because when it does happen, it's a win-win. When it gets to court, it's a little bit too late.
Right.
So.
Oh, good points.
Thank you so much, Tara. I'm now going to turn the time over to Kate. She has a question for you.
Great, thank you so much, Brandy. So, Representative Winder. Last week, Representative Sandra Hollins gave an impassioned plea about banning chokeholds. So you wear multiple hats. As a legislator and a city official, how are you using your influence to assure that officers in our state and cities are in fact there to protect and serve and not harm communities of color?
Great question, Kate. Like you say, I wear a few hats and I have worn some hats, so this is an interesting one. First of all, as a legislator, I love Representative Hollins, and I loved her impassioned plea for this, and I was proud to co-sponsor with her her bill which banned knees on the neck and other chokeholds in the state of Utah, and to be taught at post, and made it a pretty even a felony if it's used. So we send a loud and clear message that that's not going to be tolerated in Utah. We have a lot of police jurisdictions in Utah. When I was the mayor of West Valley City, frankly, we had an officer-involved shooting with Danielle Willard. Some of you remember we had some evidence issues, and I took some bold steps there we replaced the police chief. We beefed up the civilian advisory board that we had there in West Valley City. West Valley City is one of the few cities in Utah along the Salt Lake City that has a civilian review board to look at those cases, and so that was a critical step. And it's been interesting now here at Mill Creek as a former mayor, now a staff member. I've been impressed with Mayor Silvestrini and the team here. Of course, several of our council members are women of color, and so they've expressed simultaneously great appreciation for the men and women of the Unified Police Department that serve Mill Creek, but also a desire that, hey, we need to have better training. We need to look at some of the sensitivity training and ways that officers can help de-escalate situations. Another thing I'm looking at as a legislator is I co-sponsored a bill with Representative Steve Elison last year, where we created a fund where when someone calls 911, if it's for example, a suicide attempt or a severe depression that could lead to suicide, let's not send out a fire truck and 3 police cars. That's the last thing that situation needs. Let's send out some social workers to help in those situations. And so we've been able to begin that process in the state of Utah, which is a step forward among most states. We need to look for ways to continue the dialogue, continue to listen. We need to have those discussions as elected officials on the privilege we all enjoy to varying degrees or another. I was talking to some neighbors in West Valley City, and they shared the story of a African-American neighbor of theirs. He's Black, his wife is white. He says, I can't jog around my neighborhood at night by myself without people calling the police on me. He says, I have to wait for my little girl to get home from school. And if I walk around my neighborhood with holding my little girl's hand in one hand and walking my dog in the other, then people wave at me and I'm a family man. But if I'm just jogging through the streets by myself in the evening as a Black man in his 20s, people call the police on me. And that was a sobering story for me, because I gotta tell you, as a white guy in Utah, no one's ever called the police on me jogging through the neighborhood. And so part of this dialogue is to realize the privilege we all have to varying degrees, and to check that privilege, and to try to see the world through others' eyes. And that's true when it talks about policing as well, as Kate mentioned in her question. We need to look for ways for our police officers to have the training to better understand and empathize in those situations. It seems crazy that it takes longer to be certified as a hairdresser in the state of Utah than a police officer. And God bless those men and women going through post and who are doing that there, but their resources are limited. And so I would say, to me, that the issue shouldn't be defund the police. The issue should be fund the police to have better training, to hire the best to do that job, to better protect and serve our communities, and better fund the nonprofits and the social aspects of the community that can help reduce drug addiction, that can help solve some of our housing issues, that can help solve some of these issues that spiral out of control into crime. Realize where I have a good friend here at Mill Creek, Ashley, that runs our Promise program, and she's reminded me, just remember, Mike, where the resources are is where the crime isn't. And so as we make sure we have resources out there to help people in tough situations, then the crime isn't. We also need to look for ways to keep the economic situation has a direct correlation to crime. In Chicago, 95% of the Black youth are unemployed, 95%. And when you're not you know, in Utah, that'd be 20%. And so when you're not working a job, even an entry-level job as a teenager, you're going to go find something else to do. And that's not always a good thing to do. And so there's a whole social construct with how do we make sure we have the resources, both economically and socially there, to help meet our communities of color. I represent a city that's majority minority. My House district is majority minority. And so I love that my kids go to schools where they're some of their greatest friends are people of color, and they know how to navigate that situation. That's not true for all of our police officers today. They haven't had that background. And so there's a lot more we can do and should be doing to support our police officers as they navigate these situations and as we all check our privileges. Did that, Kate, what did I miss there? You touched on a few things in your good question.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And I appreciate you mentioning all of the components that you did about privilege and access and training and making sure that we are sending the appropriately skilled individuals to homes where, or the need or the want to do this, right. Where we might not need a fire truck, EMT, and multiple police officers. Right. So I appreciate that. I want to figure out a way for us as nonprofits, because we are nonpartisan, right? We do not go, we don't play in that political pool, as it were. Mm-hmm. So how can we as nonprofits help really drive something like sending social workers to homes that where people have called police officers? How can we get something like that across the finish line? How can we help make that a priority for our legislators?
That's a great question, Kate. I would say a lot of these solutions can happen at the local level, or at least start at the local level. And as nonprofits, you're in a very unique situation because nonprofits tend to be trusted more than government and business. Nonprofits are also kind of that neutral third party, like you mentioned, Kate. They're a nonpartisan thing. And so you can help be the facilitators between some of the disparate groups out there right now that are on opposite ends of this or trying to better understand this. So I think nonprofits have a role as facilitators of some of these discussions because you are a safe space for all sides. I think nonprofits have an opportunity to reach out to a local police department. And because I can tell you, police departments right now are scratching their heads saying, boy, how do we navigate this new world? Because they don't want to just, you know, throw up the walls and militarize. They know that's not the answer. They know doing nothing is not the answer either. And so if a nonprofit were to reach out to a local police department and say, hey, how can we help in some of these situations? Start piloting some things. Because as a legislature, if we look and we see some things that are working on, wow, the Orem Police Department is now working with this local nonprofit, and in certain cases, they're bringing out these different social workers or actually dispatching them instead to help, and we're seeing some great results with that, then that's something as a legislature we can look at and say, wow, that's working. How can we make that scalable for the whole state? Now that we know that that works in this community, maybe it's worth putting some state resources behind that so we can extrapolate that model statewide. So I would say this is a new world for all of us. 2020 is an interesting year in so many ways, but it's a year of opportunity for a lot of us as we look to a fresh forward. And so Kate, I'd say to you and to others, look for a local police department that you can partner with and be a resource to. And let's get some great case studies in Utah working that we can then replicate elsewhere in the state.
Thank you so much. And we have one final question. First, I just want to acknowledge that thank you for recognizing the important space that nonprofits hold, especially when helping to facilitate difficult discussions, because our nonprofits are incredible assets in our communities and they do create that safe space and can help facilitate conversations. So thank you for acknowledging that. Our final question for today comes to a non-itemized charitable tax deduction. Would you and any of your colleagues consider an emergency state non-itemized charitable tax deduction that any Utahn can claim for donating a certain amount to charitable nonprofit organizations? The federal government has passed it and will be expanding it, along with several states passing similar measures, so that people are incentivized to help our nonprofits stay afloat during these times.
Okay, that's a great question, and frankly, a great program. I think if there's a year where we'd be open to something like that, this would be the year. Now, we're sensitive on, as you do those deductions, are we going to lose money on the other side? And so there'll be some of those budgetary concerns and angst, but I think it's a year to try to, I think everyone knows our nonprofits are going to be hurting this year, in a year when we need them the most, which is the catch-22. And so it's something like that, something we could look at. So our next interim meetings are in August. Our next special session, they say, will be August 20th. So the trick is to get something like that on the call for the special session, which is not an easy thing because they had 125 requests last time, 27 made it through. And so there's other bills that we're already working on that didn't make the call last time that we're already working on for August. And so something like that, my honest advice would be, if there's a legislator in leadership that can get passionately behind this, that's how you're going to see it through. As I am a committee chair, and that gives me more clout than just maybe a freshman legislator. But what we're finding in these emergency times is decisions are being made fast and furious at the Senate President, Speaker of the House, Majority Leader, those levels. And so if you can get a Speaker Wilson or Majority Leader Gibson or any of the leadership team, any of them to be passionate behind that and carry that ball and run with it, then it's not out of the realm of possibility on seeing that in the August special session, or we may even have to have an October one, who knows. And so I think having something like that in the conversation would be very helpful. I'm happy to champion it best I can, but I'm not the Speaker of the House either, so for good or for bad.
Well, I will say I've written down the dates and we're going to start reaching out. This is something that the Utah Nonprofits Association has really been working hard to champion at both the federal and the state level. So we really appreciate that insight into how to get this working, especially during this time of how decisions are being made, and the speediness and the timeliness that needs to happen.
My insider advice is it's not too soon to start bending the ear of, when the speaker gets bombarded with stuff. So maybe you look at a Mike Schultz or a Francis Gibson, okay, that are also on the leadership team. And you get one of those guys excited about it, and they'll sell their colleagues. And if the leadership's behind it, the rest of the house will fall in line.
All right.
But I would work on that. I would reach out to them sooner rather than later so that it can be in the queue for August. And it'll be interesting to see where they go. But that would be my insider baseball advice on that.
Thank you so much. We're going to take it. I don't know if you saw, but both Kate and I were writing madly. So
okay, good. Let's do it.
Let's get this bill August 20th. So I would like to turn the time over now to Kate. Thank you so much, Representative Winder, for your time and your dedication and passion for nonprofits.
And I hope you feel that I do have a passion for nonprofits and my sincerity and empathy and appreciation for you all. I apologize if I don't have the answers to everything, but I don't think any guest on this show would. So, but together we'll figure all this out together. All right.
And
Kate.
I really love that you said that, because this work requires extensive relationship building and understanding from all angles. So being able to have conversations that are difficult and challenging, being able to bring something to your attention that may or may not work, but to hear what your feedback might look like, I think is just incredibly helpful and useful. And I heard two major calls to action today. One, I heard to continue telling our legislators about the housing needs within our communities. And also I heard that the Utah Nonprofits Association will be working quite heavily to figure out how we can get a charitable deduction as an emergency stopgap measure to assist nonprofit organizations. So count on us being able to tap into you if we need your assistance throughout. But I just appreciate, as Brandy mentioned, your time today in having this conversation with our members. So thank you so much, and you can have the last words here.
Okay, great, Brandy and Kate. Thank you everybody for taking the time, and we know this is recorded so others can tap into it as well. And I like to think conversations like these aren't intend to be the end all be all, but hopefully there's some ideas that have come to you as we've talked today, where you will reach out to your local police department or your local legislator. You know, you have a friend in me, so you're always welcome to reach out to me. And I do chair the the House of Representatives Economic Development and Workforce Services Committee. So some of your issues do come before our committee, which is good. So know that you have a friend in the House, and keep making friends in the House and Senate, because that will help your cause in the long run too. So thanks for all you're doing, especially in this crazy year of 2020, and blessings to all of you.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks.
Take care.